well. I still got a little bit of pasting to do.
Okay, hi everyone. I think we're live now, joining us for our second Atlassian live stream to talk about topics Agile and DevOps with some of our industry experts. I'm delighted to be here today. My name's Susie. I am the head of product for DevOps at Atlassian, where I support our product teams building DevOps experiences in Jira Software, Bitbucket, and Status Page. I'm joined here today by two industry experts from Agilent. I'll introduce myself a little bit more, and then I'll pass over to John and Doug for their introductions. So prior to joining Atlassian, I spent most of my career building software for engineering teams, primarily open source CI/CD products, as well as some agile planning products as well. I've also spent some time as a consultant enabling software teams to go on their agile and their DevOps transformations. And for me, I'm most excited about enabling teams to improve their software delivery performance so that they can support their businesses. So I'm a firm believer that DevOps is not just about technology, it's not just about software, but it's about business change. And I hope that we can explore all of those things today. So technology, process, and also culture in our live stream. So I'd like to pass over to John Sadler from Agilent for your intro, John.
Thanks, Susie, and thanks everybody who's attending. I'm John. I'm the General Manager of Software and Informatics at Agilent, which is responsible for not all, but a significant plurality of the software that Agilent Technologies produces. They don't let me write code anymore, but in past lives, I've been an open source author and a developer for all kinds of production software, ranging from real-time firmware for various kinds of instruments to medical device software and internet sites and all kinds of things in between. So I'm really happy to have had the opportunity to lead this particular team. I think our products are really cool, and I love the continuous improvement ethic that everybody's got here. Doug?
That sounds great. And you, Doug? Yeah, please go ahead.
I am Doug Ferrante. I'm also at Agilent. I'm in John Sadler's organization. I spent 30 years doing software development, but the last 5 or so of them, I've not had my hands in on the code either. They don't allow me in now, but I do manage the development teams for parts of the software that we have. And over the last 3 years, I've been managing the DevOps team, where it's an incredible new world, and it's very clear to me that this is actually where the leaps and bounds are. So I'm excited on this topic as well.
Cool, that's great. Yeah, I think we're all eager to dive in. Before we get started, I did want to do some for our audience here today. We will probably be talking about how you all at Agilent have measured your DevOps performance. And I think in particular, we might be talking about cycle time, lead time for changes, and deployment frequency. So before we dive into the specifics, we kind of wanted to just kind of set the ground and set the context for everyone about why those are important and what they mean. And so here we nicely have a slide that shows us some of those important DevOps metrics. So lead times for changes, often being the length of time between a code change that gets committed and out to a deployable state. Also deployment frequency, I think that's one of the things that you all have been looking at. So understanding how frequently new code is put into production, or for you, it may be a different point in your life cycle, and we'll get into those details. And then those two particular kind of velocity metrics are often used alongside change, failure rate, and mean time to recovery. And those are the 4 key metrics that DevOps Research and Assessment, I think everybody's familiar with DORA these days, they've identified those as key measures that indicate the performance of a software deployment team, a software development team. And we know that elite performers are often have a very short lead time, so less than a day for lead time for changes, and are deploying multiple times a day. So just so that our audience here understands why we might be talking about some of those metrics. So let's get into what you all have been doing. John, could you kick us off by giving us some background on what it is you all do at Agilent, the industry you work in, and the kinds of software you build?
Yep, happy to do that. Thanks, Susie. So Agilent, first of all, is one of the sort of HP diaspora companies. So we spun off of Hewlett Packard back in, I think, 1999. And today, after one more spin out, Agilent is a pure life sciences company. We do several things. We make diagnostics for cancer, for COVID, and we make nucleic acid therapeutics. We also make instrumentation for measuring the purity of ingredients of all kinds, ranging from chemical precursors to food. And so our instruments are in use in a variety of industries. And we also, of course, make the software, the services to support those instruments, and the consumables to go with those instruments. And so we make the software that runs a substantial fraction of our instrument fleet, called OpenLab. And OpenLab also manages lab data, scientific data, throughout its life cycle, captures results from the instruments and controls them, obviously, provides workflow automation. In the kind of work that we do, it's typically mission critical. You're typically you're potentially making decisions that affect the quality or outcome of some piece of work that you're doing there. And so it's important to capture the full context of how the information was derived. It's important to maintain high data integrity, and our customers tend to be somewhat change averse. The majority, I may be jumping ahead here, but the majority of our installed base is on-prem today. We expect that will change pretty quickly. COVID has handed us quite a tailwind in that regard. And so we're moving quickly to do that. But for now, almost all of our install base is on-prem, with a substantial fraction of it now starting to move to infrastructure as a service. And we expect that in the not too distant future, we will start to see pickup in software as a service as well. But a good substantial fraction of our installed base actually does either verification or validation of software, meaning that when they change something, they need to confirm that those changes are not breaking their existing workflows and continue to provide usable results before they push them into production. And so that tends to really greatly increase their cost to absorb change unless we help them. So that will drive a lot of the conversation after this, because that affects how we do our DevOps.
Yeah, definitely. And am I right in understanding that some of those, or yourself, you're in a regulated industry, or some of your customers would be, in those heavily regulated processes? Yeah.
Right. So we serve the pharmaceutical industry, for example. So FDA regulated, quite a bit of concern about preventing fraud, for example, in drug formulation, that sort of thing. We also serve the food authenticity industry. So once again, the regulatory pressure is moving in that direction. We do a little bit of work in forensics, which is essentially a highly adversarial field where everything that you do is going to be contested by opposing counsel. And probably the least regulated of the industries we serve is chemical and energy, but because of the national security implications of chemical and energy infrastructure, and because of, I would just say, the cost to disrupt production, they are still quite change averse, even though they're not regulated in the same ways.
Yeah, I think this is a really exciting story, because often when I have these conversations with people, they'll be like, well, DevOps works for SaaS products, it works for B2C products. I think everybody has in their mind the Googles, the Facebooks, the Netflix of these worlds, and they're not, they really think that working on-premise regulated industries is going to make this really challenging. What's your perspective on that, John, in terms of, does that add something, does it make it different from your perspective? What does DevOps bring for you? Or
I want to let. Can I invite Doug to tackle this one
oh,
briefly? And
please,
I have
yes,
comments as well, but I'd be interested
absolutely.
to see what you think.
Yeah, no,
So-
we're all here
Yep.
together.
I think the key thing for us is that John mentioned that we have software that runs a lot of instruments and a lot of different pieces. We have a software suite. And part of that means that we have a bunch of pieces that all have to act together, and they all have to act in different configurations. Is it on a workstation? Is it in a client server environment? Is our different versions are mixing and matching with each other? That, whether it on-prem or in the cloud, that is a huge DevOps challenge of taking yourself from the ancient world of just saying I built something to going that next step of saying I've built it and I've tested it in every imaginable scenario, every scenario I can imagine that can make me confident that that one change that I made is not just going to break some corner I never dreamed of, and do all of that in a time frame as the as John likes to put it, when the time it takes to get a cup of coffee. That's impossible without some serious DevOps involvement and using the tools, because you can't do all that manually with the complex suite that we have.
And can whoever's best to answer this, can you let me know why you started? Like what problems, what challenges did you see that kind of took you on this journey, and what gave you this goal, commit or crash in a coffee break?
So at a very high level, I mean, let me just build on what Doug just said and say that I think, normally when you think of DevOps, you think, you push to production, right? So commit a change, push to production, see what happens, right? We can't afford to see what happens. We have to be very, very confident we're not going to break our customers' code, but also because so much of our stuff is on-prem, it's pull to production effectively. The customer has to take it. So we have to, given being respectful of their cost of change, we have to do very good queuing, I'm going to call it change queuing effectively, having very, very good discipline about separating out things that are bug fixes from things that are feature adds, and then beginning to move in the direction of designing in a code architecture that allows our customers to minimize the cost of change so that they can take change faster. And eventually we want to get to a place where we actually could do SaaS in a regulated environment, or push to production in a regulated environment with infrastructure as a service, where our customers can actually keep up. Today they can't because of how we do it. We originally started out that every release was a monolithic release with everything but the kitchen sink in it, and it was very, very difficult for our customers to tell a bug fix from a feature release because there was no queuing. So a long time ago we separated those two things out. We got very disciplined about saying bug fixes come at a pretty fast cadence, but they're very, very low impact in terms of change management. And then feature releases come at a slower cadence. I mean, you're going to laugh if anybody who's in a SaaS environment is going to laugh, but we release changes, major feature changes about once a year. We have an underlying release cadence that's faster than that, but our customers still think that's too fast. And so, and the reason is cost of change. So we remove internal cycle times and compress them for reasons we'll talk about later on. The external cycle times are really driven in part by market constraints and in part by the maturity of how our code is built. At least that's kind of how I like to see it, that there's an opportunity here to use technology to actually help solve the cost of change problem for customers. So originally, we started thinking about cycle times to essentially to fix field defects. So you mentioned the change failure rate. I mean, for us, we typically measure not so much the change failure rate, because oftentimes in a feature release, a lot of changes go into one bucket, so they don't come out discreetly. But we do look at the rate at which we get field defects back on a release, and then we give ourselves a cycle time goal on how fast we want to have a fix for any field reported defect that comes back, and we've given ourselves 6 weeks to 80%. So and we generally are pretty good at that. We've driven those rates down. So that was kind of the first the first time we really started to push cycle time beyond having a cadence for sprints, for example, and then a cadence for releases.
Yep. Great. And I'm curious, you started off with like this kind of, the ability to, get these bug fixes to your customers. How did your customers respond to that? Were you able to see some positive impact? And is that kind of what, pushed you further on to look at other things? Like, what has the reaction been to some of those changes?
What do you think, Doug?
Well, I think that the most important part about those bug fixes and those patches was a predictability of us getting something out when we said we were going to. You asked about what started us on this journey too. It's part of the same thing, which is we could get those 12-month things out, but then that predictability of what those fixes were coming and when, something we really couldn't do with any type of confidence. And when look back far enough, I mean, we were measuring ourselves on cycle times that included a full build that took 3 days to do. And when you're in that world, it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So that was our starting point. So now, as we kept pushing that and getting it to where, hey, let's get a build a day. Let's get a couple of builds a day. Let's go do something so that not only do we have a build, but we're pretty sure that we didn't break something with that build.
Yeah.
Now you can get to where we have a customer confidence that our software updates are going to be coming out there at some sort of a cadence they can count on with the things in it that we said that we're going to be in there. And even though we said we were going to do it on one configuration, the fact that we have invested in the DevOps and doing things with as much automation as we can, that we fix something on a workstation and it doesn't blow up something on some massive client server installation.
Yeah, I think you make a really good, a really important point. I think a lot of people focus on the speed of things when they think about DevOps, but actually it's about, are we doing this sustainably? Can you all sustain it, your organization? Can your customers sustain it? Like, is it safe for them? Like, do they feel confident? And then the piece I think, Doug, you've made really clear is that predictability. You're now able to do those pieces. And so, although that cadence, is different than what many people might expect, you can achieve those other pieces as well.
That predictability and the quality, speed's irrelevant if you don't have the quality, and that in my mind is the biggest part of what DevOps is doing in here, is enabling us to get to a higher quality that we can trust, let alone our customers. Yeah.
And it sounds like, when you first started, you had these long running builds. So if we think about like that CI/CD loop, the continuous integration was obviously
we're
perhaps
lucky to get
not
a build done.
Continuous. Yeah, perhaps we wouldn't necessarily say it was a continuous loop. But would you say that was one of the biggest challenges you had? Like, what was the sort of biggest sort of barrier to getting started? Was it process, tooling, culture?
There was a little bit of each of those, but I would start with, there was some process things. There was some very serious process things that we had to get ourselves, that changed our culture. When we started using Jira and forced ourselves to go and stay within this process of the stories that are tracked in there, have your test cases with the right scope and so on, and then put those into the builds and automate through the builds. That was the breakthrough point. Prior to that, someone would throw something in, someone else didn't even know what was going on. So those two things got us going down the right path, and it started building on itself, so that now everything we do has to be within the context of the process we are using, and scripting things rather than manual testing or anything like that. And that's using the tools.
Yeah, back in the dawn of time, relatively speaking, a few years ago anyway, we had to will this whole thing into existence. I think we went from having, and there's a link out to a white paper that talks a little bit about some of the background there, but we really went from having not a particularly uniform way of doing agile development. We sort of said we were doing it, but it wasn't consistent enough that we could really get our arms around it and portfolio manage it, even though it was a fairly sizable team. We weren't very predictable in releases, and we didn't, and we tended to. And this is a late breaking revelation for me, because I keep saying this all the time, that you have to pick the order of the three canonical priorities, right? That you have to decide what order you're going to do scope, cadence, and quality in. If you don't pick them, they'll be picked for you. And usually the way that they're picked, if you don't say anything, is the scope goes first, a deadline goes second, and quality goes third. And so we've kind of flipped those around backwards and said, no, quality goes first. And I'll talk about what that means in a second. Cadence goes second, which pretty much means we always hit the cadence. And then scope gets slipped if we misestimate or something like that, or we have an emergency. Scope is the thing that gets ejected. And that's given us the ability to have, I guess I'd say, a more reproducible process. It also tends to expose our inherent waste and the payload that we have able to deliver to market for each one of these things. And then it starts to make it really interesting to start working on things like having a repeatable process, which back at the dawn of time, we also didn't have. We had multiple transatlantic hops, and we were lucky if we got a build done every week. There was a time when Doug had like one of those traffic light poles in his cubicle that would signal when his team had broken the build, right? And everybody had like these lights of shame in their tubes, so that if you broke the build, a red light went off saying that your team had broken the build. We got past that pretty fast. After that, we got to the point where we didn't break any builds, but it still took a long time. And in the last, I don't know, couple of years, I guess I'd say, Doug's team has gotten us to the point where we went from, maybe a build a week to now we're doing, from commit to smoke test in an hour, something like that. So a very, very substantial improvement in those rates, which gives you a lot of confidence. I mean, effectively, if you don't know until a week later whether a code change that you made broke something, you have no ability to, you really have to completely context switch and reload everything that you were thinking at the time. And software development is such a short-term memory intensive task, right? You really have to get the context on your head and keep it there long enough to make the change and understand why it happened. So that having a short turn, I mean, even an hour is still too long, but that's much better. At least you still remember what you were doing at the time. A week later, you don't. It might as well be somebody else's code a week later. So that's a huge change for us, and it really leads to more confidence. It means that there's a lot of automated test development that's going on in there. And, people always talk about refactoring code, right? If you don't have a good automated test framework, you're not refactoring. You're just taking a jump. So these are necessary foundation steps, and it's helped us out a lot.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot has gone on in that journey. We had a question pop up that was about like the business outlook. I can answer the DevOps, the Atlassian piece specifically, but I'm curious, like, as a software professional, I can hear the things that you're saying, John and Doug, and I can feel that transformation, right? As a software practitioner, like what the impact is on your engineers and your software teams. But in terms of like your business outlook, like how have you been able to give that confidence to your business as well, and your customers? Like, can they see this change? Like, how do you view that impact?
I'll take the first one, and Doug can come after. But I would say that first of all, our customers know that they can trust us to do what we say we're going to do. Doug already alluded to that earlier on.
Yeah.
So, when we say that we're going to have a bug fix for you in a few weeks, they know that they can count on it. In fact, they've gotten to the point now where they know that's going to happen for them if they have a problem. And so they trust us more. When your customers trust you more, this is going to sound really strange, but when your customers trust you more, and you tell them that you're working on a capability, that's almost as good as having it from the perspective of what they're concerned. As long as they know they can count on you to deliver it, our customers tend to adopt fairly slowly. So being able to trust that you will be along with them for the ride is almost as good as having stuff, which is pretty powerful. And I guess equally importantly, all the work that we've done here has really driven down the field defect rate in general, We just have a lot fewer of them, and they don't tend to turn into emergencies. So that's a pretty great thing. It means that once again, our customers have an easier ride of it when they do absorb change, and they recognize that. And finally, because of the fact that we're focused on cycle time for resolving those, it means our R&D team gets out and involved with customers, which means they make better design decisions going forward. Doug?
There was so prior to managing this, the R&D team I have right now and the DevOps team, I spent a couple of years in the support organization. And there was a phrase that I grew to really dislike. And that phrase was, did anybody ever test this? And so my answer to what is that, how has it affected business outlook is that in the last 2 to 3 years, I might have heard that phrase twice. And to me, what is so key about that is that, I've said it a couple of times, that coverage of all the things that you could possibly affect. And one of the things I don't think we mentioned, our development is all through around the world. There isn't a moment during the day that somebody isn't hands-on working on the code bases of this suite. So how do you keep that all together in all the configurations with a high enough quality that horrific phrase, did anyone ever test this, can somehow start disappearing from the lexicon of our in the customer community? That is my anecdotal, one of my measurements that I've used is that phrase that I hate is it is going away. And I believe it's because of that. DevOps is a huge reason why it's going away.
I think that's really powerful, and I will listen out for that phrase now as well, because I think you're right. It does speak a lot about how you're perceived, and I think if it's going away, that's really powerful. So we have a question here for either of you again. What criteria do you generally apply to identify or distinguish between? We've been talking about bugs or changes or new features. So how do you all distinguish those things, and any insight there to help people who are also making these changes?
So I can take a first stab at that, John, where there's a bug is, it's a pretty tight distinction when you're in a highly regulated environment where your software is supposed to work in a way that you say it's going to work. So if you go and run, and all our customers, as John said, they have to validate before they can even use our software in production. So they go and run and use every feature that they're going to use and say, okay, now it's working exactly as we expect. Well, if there's a deviation from that, from we tell them how it's supposed to work and how it actually works, that's the bug category. A change is when they look at it and go, okay, I see how it works, but I'd prefer it if it works some other way. And it's pretty clear when you've got that very strict validation that's going on. And new features are just simply things that don't exist right now, where we didn't even, haven't even started going down that path. So that, to me, that's the starting point of these. And I know there's gray areas in between, but that's how I line it up.
Yeah, this is a very incisive question. The what's a bug versus what's a feature can be very political in a development organization. It often is, particularly in development organizations that don't have predictable delivery. The reason being that marketing, if marketing is starving, then any release window looks like an opportunity to get their stuff out. And so effectively, you want your marketing team to have a high confidence that they will be able to get new capabilities into the software on some reasonable window that they can commercialize, and be exceptionally disciplined about being able to deliver to your install base only those things that they must have in order to keep running without revalidating. And once again, that this validation or verification, right? Verification is essentially making sure that the software does what it's supposed to do, what it said it would do. and validation is making sure that it works in your workflow. So validation is really, you can think of those two things as the two competing definitions of quality. Validation is about fitness for use, and verification is about conformance to specs. So we have to meet both. But essentially what Doug is saying is that a bug is something that doesn't conform to specs effectively. And a feature is, it may be a fitness for use thing, or it may be a whole new capability that we want to add, but it often cross-cuts parts of the system. So bug fixes tend to be, really surgical as much as possible. We try to minimize the possibility for spillover of side effects into other parts of the code and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's very consistent with how I have looked at it as well. I think one thing that you shared there is that those definitions become really important when you don't have this predictable cadence. And I was just thinking through that aspect of it. I definitely have seen that myself in organizations where you are really challenged to squeeze everything in and push everything out. Then there's a lot more discussion about how many bugs and how much of this and how much of that. Whereas as I've moved with organizations to this more predictable, sustainable pace, it kind of is just like, well, which is the most important change? Like, okay, it may be a bug or it may be a new capability. Like, which do we as the business determine is most impactful? And that's the one, those are the ones we want to change. So I think, yeah, you kind of highlight the importance of that regular, predictable nature that kind of erases the need for those definitions. Please go ahead, John.
Deliberately reserve bandwidth in our releases so that we don't actually have to make a bug feature trade-off. We actually reserve capacity. Although it's gotten smaller and smaller and smaller over time, we reserve capacity for defect fix windows so that we can, not quite guarantee, but essentially we make sure that we have built-in capacity to meet our promise about being able to turn around bug fixes at a particular rate.
That's great.
Yeah.
Doug, did you want to say anything else? Otherwise, I'm going to take this question for you. I think everyone wants to know.
So
how do you work?
So the agile process for dev primarily is Scrum. We have 2-week sprints and Scrum teams that are all throughout the world and so on and throughout this suite. And for most of the release cycles that we are doing, the DevOps team, where it is involved with those Scrum teams, is actually working within the context of those same 2-week cycles. We'll have somebody on our DevOps team that's working with the Scrum team directly, and they're aware of the 2 weeks that the definitions have done within those Scrum teams. But it is not, the DevOps team is not the Scrum team. It is still has something separate because we have to keep the environment running. It is something where it doesn't matter what your sprint schedules were if the build isn't working or none of the automated tests are going. So it's the DevOps winds up having to go into some firefighting when it is required, but by and large, what we're trying to do is stay as consistent with the Scrum teams as they're doing, and mostly enable them to do all of the work that they need to do without us being too involved. When we're really involved with the Scrum team, we know that we need to keep teaching them how to use the environment more than doing it for them. Because in a perfect world, the DevOps isn't going to be in those Scrum teams. It's going to be doing some crazy things to enable way more powerful automation. And it'll have its own cycle. We actually do some Scrum. It's more of a Kanban, but some Scrum Kanban type things within DevOps for the types of things that we're doing as well.
And what kind of, I just want to, before we move to this question on the screen, I was just going to ask what kind of work that DevOps team is doing. You mentioned like more powerful automation. These are all types of work that enable your Scrum teams. Are there other examples, Doug? So we can learn more about how you set that up.
It starts with every hookup between everything being done in Jira The Scrum teams are working in Jira. The DevOps team is trying to make sure that there is a very clean automation that goes from Bitbucket over to Jira, into the build system, from the build system to a provisioning system, into automation, and ready to go out the door. That whole lineup of making sure that all of that does not require any manual interaction and is as scriptable as possible. That is the foundation of what the DevOps team is doing. And where we start getting involved with the Scrum teams is when we have another provisioning, when we opened up so that the provisioning of machines could happen in AWS instead of just on-prem. Helping the Scrum teams see what they needed to do in their scripting to take advantage of that. And building, the more and more automation. I think that was the question you were asking.
Yeah, it was. I wanted to know like the kinds of things that DevOps team are supporting, because I think often in this world, we see lots of different team topologies, different ways that are set up, and I think it's interesting to know how your DevOps team are enabling your Scrum teams. So yeah, you answered that. And then we have a question here.
One thing I'd just like to add.
Oh yeah, please.
Just a quick digression. So one thing that Doug mentioned earlier on is that because we have a lot of on-prem, we tend to need to test in a pretty broad perplexity of configurations, right? So one of the things that Doug's team did that really made that move a lot faster was to automate the stand-up of those test configurations. So we have to run tests against a whole bunch of different configurations, from a single instance running on a workstation PC up to a distributed client server installation of some sort, potentially in in infrastructure as a service, and so that the cycle time to stand up those machines was quite significant, and the cycle time to run the suite of tests was quite significant also, and that's come down really substantially because of the team.
That's great. Yeah, and presumably as you do more and more automation, you look for them to help with the, and you said you were thinking about going to a SaaS and other types of environments. They'll continue to support that deployment frequency and the different times of testing that you need to when you move to that.
One of the things about going to the SaaS model is that DevOps has to get there first.
Yeah.
So although John says we're getting there, in DevOps, we're looking at it saying, oh my God, we have got to be there now. So there are parts of what we need to do, what the dev teams need to do in the future. The DevOps, we've already got ourselves ready. Parts of what we've told them, parts of what we haven't, we don't want them to use it yet. But
that's great.
But DevOps is in front.
Yeah. Do you want to take a look at this question? I'm sorry. About how you're how you're using some of your I know you use Atlassian products obviously, but other products as well to facilitate kind of that onboarding of new features from your business teams. And I think we're talking at a slightly different part in the process.
This is like three questions in one.
It is, yeah.
This is many questions in one. I mean, it's how do you go about defining and onboarding new features from external business teams? So we do have to do that. We're very much sort of in the middle, gluing together a bunch of parts of Agilent that make instruments and need software coverage for them. We're also glued into the deployment services team. So we get requests coming, from customers. We get requests coming from divisions to support products that they need to get to the field, and we get requests coming from our support and deployment team for continuous improvement in the deployability of products and supportability of products. And so we do have a kind of a scaled Agile for Enterprise type process that we use. The Atlassian tools happen, that we use Jira and Confluence, and we're starting to think about how to take that to one layer greater remove. So we've been looking at some products to help us with that. I don't think we've made a call yet. I don't know, Doug, whether you've heard anything about that, but that's essentially we use it's a combination of tools and process. I mean, part of what's essential for being able to manage cross-business issues is the predictability that Doug alluded to before. People have to know that you got a fighting chance of doing what you say you're going to do before they'll trust you with anything. And And then you need to have a really good mediation process, which is still a work in progress, right? Everybody thinks their business priorities are the most important ones. Some businesses can't choose priorities at all, and they'll come at you with 20 different requests that they say are all top priority, and we have to decide for them. And eventually, after many years, they probably will figure out that when you come at me with many things and you say that they're all top priority, what you're essentially saying is that you want me to pick which one is top priority. So we have a messy process for doing that. It usually works. It generally starts with our being able to reflect exactly how much capacity we have available for doing that kind of work. And then people fight over it. A lot of negotiation ensues. People skinny down their requests. We get more realistic about when things are actually going to be ready, and usually it comes out, but it's messy. We do have tools, and Jira and Confluence are important, and more on the way. Doug?
I actually think that the disciplined use of Jira is one of the more important things that we did to get to that predictability. I've been in this organization longer than John has, so I saw in the past where you might be working on something, but there's always some other angle or tangent or something. Something blows up the time that you're trying to work on something, and your predictability's gone. The discipline of staying within whatever the epics and stories are that you have, that you're committed to in a sprint. That is the most important part of what I see happening, what you're brought in and how we're using them, is that it doesn't exist if it's not a story. The stories have to be together in their epics, and the developers aren't going to work at it unless it's well-defined. Because of that setup and the discipline to stay in there, predictability, it became something that was achievable.
Yeah, I think you're right. In my own experience, when I think about DevOps, that ability to define, I call that like a definition of done. How do we know when we're done? We all need to know what it is to have this feature done. And then the other part from a product management side is let's make that small. Let's have the ability to make a predictable change, is that's a small piece of doneness. And then we'll have another small piece of doneness, and they add up incrementally to add value. And I think that is something that Jira can help with, and sounds like it's been successful for you. So we're getting through our time. So I'm just going to ask you both one last question before we sign off. So, you definitely have a lot of experience, and like I said at the beginning, in an area where I think people think largely like it's not possible to work in this way. So what are your kind of 3 words or one sentence? I genuinely think that, though, people are often just like, oh no, it's not for us. And I think you're proof that this, you can do this with on-premise in regulated industries. And so what are your words of advice for people, in a similar situation? They're starting their DevOps journey. It looks insurmountable, maybe. What would you advise, Doug? And then we'll pass to you, John.
You want 3 words, or do you want a long advice?
3 words, one sentence.
If there were 3 words, I would say scripts, provisioning, and automation.
Sounds great.
First thing I thought was automation, but I could be a little better with that.
That's perfect. And what about you, John? Your words of wisdom.
Well, I probably gave more than 3, but I'll say cycle time focus. To elaborate a bit, cycle time really drives quality. And so, those 2 things are good friends. Sometimes people imagine that there's a dichotomy, that there's a trade-off. You can either have cycle time or quality. It's not really true. You can't have cycle time if you don't have quality. And cycle time is easy to measure, and so you can make a very, very fast feedback loop on cycle time, where you say, hey, we blew our cycle time, what happened? Do a root cause analysis, understand the problem. Most of the time that becomes a quality problem or a quality related problem. So squeezing cycle time is usually a really, really good way to get your quality together, and it's a really good way to drive continuous improvement. So if you want to be a learning-based organization, a continuously improving organization, which is what we strive for, it's looking at cycle time is a pretty good way to start.
Okay, great. I think you heard it. Automation, provisioning, scripting, and then take a look at your cycle time. And and know that that helps you with your quality as well. So thank you so much, John and Doug.
Thank you.
For everybody watching in, you can learn more about the journey of Agilent at Atlassian.com. And it's been so delightful to hear more about that journey. Thank you again, and thanks to our audience for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you all again next time.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.